There was a time when Spain produced its own steel and bread, but joining Europe came at a price.
There was a time when Spain had the largest fishing fleet in Europe. Factories roaring in every province, fields producing more than we could eat. We were a country that made its own ships, its own steel, its own clothes, and its own bread. A country that lived off its own work and looked at the sea and the land with pride. But one day we signed a pact. They told us it was a ticket to the future, and what came was the greatest economic dismantling in our history. This is the hidden price of joining Europe. Cheers. Spain, 1985. The Franco era was already in the past, but the 78 regime was still under construction. The country was coming out of a difficult decade. Oil crisis, high inflation, high unemployment, and a political transition with its highs and lows. In this scenario, the European Economic Community appeared as a promise of salvation. They told us that joining was the ticket to modernity, prosperity, and international recognition. The official speeches repeated the same words: investment, employment, modernization. But in the offices of Brussels, they spoke a different language: adaptation, restructuring, structural adjustment. Spain became the 12th member of the Economic Community after the signing of the Treaty of Accession, which took place on June 12, 1985. The ceremony at the Royal Palace was presented as a historic moment. The press spoke of the great leap forward. What almost no one explained was that the leap came with a hidden price. That price was written in technical clauses, in annexes that only a few specialists actually read. They were very specific commitments: shutting down part of our industry, reducing the fishing fleet, limiting our agricultural and livestock production. And all of it, according to Brussels, was to avoid distortions in the common market.
At that time, Spain was a problem for some European partners because of these things.
Spain. We were the leading fishing power on the continent. We produced more fruits, vegetables, and oil than many countries combined. Our shipyards competed with France, Italy, or Germany for international contracts. In other words, we were strong in sectors that others didn't want to see grow any further. In the months leading up to joining, Brussels had already made the path clear: industrial restructuring and modernization. Yes, but understood as reduction, as planned dismantling. In 1984, even before signing the treaty, the socialist government of Felipe González had already begun closures and cutbacks in the steel and shipbuilding industries to meet the community's demands. The strikes at the shipyards in Cadiz, Ferrol, or Bilbao were no coincidence. They were the first cost of integration. In exchange, they promised us European funds, the so-called cohesion aid, money for roads, infrastructure, and technological modernization. What few people said is that much of that money would go back to the countries that gave it, because the projects would be awarded to their companies.
They sold us the idea that the future was guaranteed, but the future that would come would be very different from what we imagined.
This is the starting point. The Spain that enters Europe is a country with real strength at sea, in the countryside, and in industry. What we're going to see now is how, step by step, those pillars were dismantled. Not by accident, not by incompetence, but because it was agreed that way from the beginning.
The nice word was restructuring. The real result: closures, cutbacks, and thousands of families adrift.
The shipbuilding restructuring didn't start the day we signed the accession. It was written in Europe's fine print since the late 70s. The Council of the Economic Community set the restructuring of the sector in 1978 and issued directives to limit aid and capacity that all states had to implement. Spain joined the game in 1986 with the rules already set, and modernization meant reducing size and aid to avoid distorting the common market. In the 90s, Brussels approved a large package of public aid for our shipyards, with very tough conditions, less capacity, and in specific cases, effective closure. The Commission authorized the restructuring of the Spanish public shipyards in 1997 and made that approval conditional on strict limits. A symbol of that straitjacket was Astano in Ferrol. The Commission made it clear in 2000 that it had to remain closed to shipbuilding as a condition for the aid. It couldn't compete like before. Its current workforce is less than 300 people out of the 6,000 it once had. Despite the calls for it, it hasn't manufactured for more than 30 years. The pressure continued. In 1995, the INI itself, National Institute of Industry, spoke of the third restructuring in 11 years and of a last chance for the sector, with an excess workforce of more than 5,000 workers, and a plan that, if it went wrong, could mean the end of the shipbuilding industry in Spain. At the same time, the schedule negotiated with Brussels set a deadline for the aid and considered closing plants in Cadiz and Seville if the numbers didn't add up. In 1999, the Commission still authorized 855 million euros until 2003 to close, adjust workforces, or invest in R&D, in the midst of a global price war with South Korea in the background. The steel industry was the other front. In 1984, the government enacted the Steel Industry Restructuring by decree. The most dramatic case was the Altos Hornos del Mediterráneo in Sagunto, whose closure was announced in 1983 and confirmed in 1984, triggering an unprecedented mobilization in the city. 4 decades later, it is remembered as the breaking point. Thousands of jobs lost and an entire region forced to reinvent itself. Contemporary reporting was already talking about what was coming. Never-ending restructuring injured people, deaths, and thousands laid off or forced into early retirement, with the steel and shipbuilding industries at the epicenter of the social conflict. In 1992, the final blow came. Under the technical name of the Integrated Steel Corporation Plan, or CSI, the government agreed to cut 9,707 jobs and reduce production capacity from 7 to 4.5 million tons. The plan meant shutting down 4 of the 6 blast furnaces that were still operating in Spain. Only a few facilities would remain standing, concentrating all production and leaving historic factories that had given life to entire cities empty. 2 years later, the European Commission issued a decision to authorize aid to the CSI. It was a yes to the funding, but with fine print, more cuts, more closures, and strict monitoring to ensure that Spain did not exceed the limits set by Brussels. In short, the aid was coming, but the price was giving up a good part of our industrial capacity. Between 1983 and 1986, the toughest phase of the restructuring unfolded, with strikes, marches, and a social cost that continued to drag on throughout the decade. Entire regions like Bahía de Cádiz, Ferrolterra, Nervión, and Camp de Morvedre went from industrial strongholds to landscapes of empty plants and mass early retirement. At the same time, part of the European cohesion funds that arrived to ease the blow went back to the donor countries through construction contracts awarded to their large companies.
Spain was told modernize, And modernizing meant shutting down where we were strong so as not to disturb the common market.
If steel was brought to its knees, the sea wasn't spared either. Now we come to the deepest wound for a country that was born looking at the Atlantic, the fleet.
Spain looked to the sea for centuries. Europe looked at her and counted ships.
There was a time when Spain docked more ships than anyone else. Dawn was a language. Engines roaring, clipped voices, flashlights on deck, the thud of crates against iron. In every port, the same music. In every dock, the same certainty. There was work, there was a horizon, there was a blue line opening up beneath the bow. And then Europe arrived with its ship, vocabulary, capacity, harmonization, overcapacity. Clean words that on the dock meant something else. Surplus, your boat is surplus, your quota is surplus. They promised us the ocean, and first they led us to a hallway. They called it a transitional period, and it seemed reasonable. Lists of authorized vessels, rules for entering without pushing. But one day, a map appeared with an invisible fence around Ireland. Irish box. It sounded like a square on a board, like a parlor trick. When the fence expired, they replaced it with another name, something more serious, more scientific, biologically sensitive area. The result was the same. Less Spanish presence where the sea yielded the most. Whoever had to stay on land was given a piece of paper and a number. There were bonuses for withdrawing boats. That was the exact word, withdraw. Later at the dock, the translation was different, blowtorch. The metal sheet opened up like a can, the hull groaned, the engine ended up in a warehouse, and the captain, at home, counted money that lasted only as long as a tide. In the documents, it was written that it was necessary, that there was overcapacity, and that the common policy had to balance the system. On the dock, it was enough to look, each season, one less hull in the line, a longer silence at departure time. Morocco was the gateway we thought was safe. Our fathers and grandfathers worked there. There were agreements in 88, 92, and 95. And with them, a part of the soul of Andalusia and the Canary Islands was sustained, until in 1999, the door slammed shut. The boats returned to port with anger burning inside them. There was talk of restructuring, layoffs, aid, and waiting for a new framework. Some would hold on, others would never see the sea from the deck again. Further north was the Grand Soul, a name that sounds hopeful but is often horizontal rain and a leaden sky. Galicia held on there the way you do in winter, gritting your teeth, bailing out without making a sound. Fewer boats, tighter quotas on what puts food on the table. Hake, megrim, monkfish, profits that barely added up and sometimes didn't. You could keep going, yes, but every year it was the same boat with less sea to fish. It wasn't a storm. Storms pass, they leave marks on your skin, and later you tell the story over wine. This was different. It was one agreement after another, one form after another, a door that was left ajar, another that closed, a blowtorch that was lit. It was a country that was born looking at the Atlantic, and that little by little stopped seeing its reflection in the water.
They promised to modernize agriculture. The recipe had 3 words: quotas, uprooting, and withdrawal.
The Spanish countryside once didn't ask for permission. Castile's wheat stretched out like a golden sea. The Andalusian olive trees produced oil for half the world. The orchards of Levante supplied Europe with fruits and vegetables. We were a breadbasket that never ran dry. The land was tough, yes, but it responded to hard work. The farmer knew what he planted and what he harvested, and the livestock grazed without anyone, except the weather, setting limits for them. Europe arrived with a new alphabet: quotas, limits, surpluses, product withdrawals. Words that sounded like order and modernity in the brochures, but in the barns and cooperatives meant something else. Uproot vineyards, slaughter livestock, leave the land fallow, even if it's fertile. The Common Agricultural Policy, the famous CAP, did bring aid, yes, but it was aid with painful conditions. Money in exchange for producing less, money in exchange for letting part of what had always provided food die. In entire villages, the scene was repeated. The truck arrived not to take the harvest, but the crop itself. In the oil mills, anger mixed with the smell of oil.
They claim there's a surplus, but supermarket prices keep rising and farmers don't benefit.
The common market, with its rules, had a clear objective: to prevent Spain, with its agricultural power, from altering prices in countries that produced less, but had more votes in Brussels. European funds for the countryside were announced at press conferences with astronomical figures. Then, when they reached the ground, they were something else. To modernize the land, but in the direction set by the community regulations. State-of-the-art greenhouses were being funded, while traditional crops that had survived for centuries were being dismantled. Robotic milking facilities were being paid for, while small livestock farms that couldn't make the required changes were being shut down. In areas like Extremadura, Castilla-La Mancha, or Jaén, many people went from working the land to watching someone else work it, or leaving it fallow because that was more profitable. The word subsidy became both a tool and a trap. The farmer who wanted to produce more would run into an invisible ceiling. The one who agreed to produce less got paid for it. The world was upside down. The blow wasn't just economic, it was cultural. The identity of entire communities, which was built on the land and the agricultural calendar, began to fade. The young people moved to the city. The old people kept looking at the sky, but now, not knowing whether to pray for rain or for the price of aid. And so, year after year, Spain went from feeding markets to filling out paperwork. The surveys said that the sector was modernizing. In the bars, people said something else: that Europe had taught us to produce less and to depend more. Spanish agriculture didn't die just because of drought or hail. It died, in part, because of a schedule of meetings in Brussels where the future was written in clauses and annexes that almost no one read, until there was nothing left to plant.
From farming to paperwork, quotas that shrink us, subsidies for uprooting, and staples that we import.
Trade liberalization. Clean words. The result was different. Workshops going dark.
There was a time when Spanish textiles dressed half the world. From Galicia to Catalonia, from Castile to Valencia. Entire towns lived off the constant sound of looms and the smell of freshly pressed cotton. They weren't just factories. Entire neighborhoods relied on every garment produced by those workshops. In 1985, the textile industry employed more than 400,000 people. It was one of the industrial sectors with the largest share of GDP and one of the biggest exporters both within and outside of Europe. Galicia concentrated on garment manufacturing, Catalonia on the cotton industry, the Valencian community on footwear, and Castilla-La Mancha and Andalusia had smaller workshops that were vital for their regions. But the agreement to join the economic community brought with it, sewn into the fine print, a threat: opening up trade without protective measures against non-member countries. This meant competing with Asian countries like China, India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, where wages were up to 20 times lower and there were no comparable social charges. The blow was not immediate. In the early 90s, big names and century-old cooperatives were still holding on, but imports skyrocketed. Between 1986 and 1995, the influx of Asian clothing grew by more than 300%, while domestic production fell at an average rate of 5% per year. In Galicia, historic factories like Rigojo and the Villalba factory closed down. In Catalonia, Sabadell and Terrassa, textile capitals for more than a century, saw their chimneys stop smoking. In the Valencian community, the closure of clothing and footwear workshops left cities like Elda and Alcoy with unemployment rates that were double the national average. By the late 1990s, the sector had lost more than 120,000 jobs, and real revenue had fallen by 40% compared to 1985.
285.
Many warehouses were converted into logistics centers for imported goods. Others were left as industrial skeletons covered in dust. Spain's textile industry didn't die because of a lack of quality or talent. It died because it was pushed into an unfair fight. The same market that was promised to us as an opportunity was the one that left us without looms, without smokestacks, and without the economic heartbeat of entire regions.
The gates were thrown wide open. The world came in. Spanish industry went out through it.
The balance.
Almost 4 decades have passed. The sound of steel returned. The smell of diesel on the docks. I remember.
The countryside learned to fill out forms before it learned to sew.
And the word that appears most often in the paperwork is the same one that hurts the most out on the street. Adaptation.
Adapting meant accepting help with conditions, modernizing by downsizing, surviving by giving up. Plants that were once giants came back to life. But with invisible fences, you could exist, but no longer compete like before. The steel industry traded the red sky for cold furnaces and efficient balance sheets. The shipyards, finally viable at the cost of being smaller. The price was paid in shifts that disappeared and in entire neighborhoods where the sirens stopped sounding. At sea, the path was shorter. We counted ships, signed quota agreements, and opened the door to scrapping. The agreements that for centuries gave us a horizon became time-limited windows. The fleet kept going for a while out of inertia, but the tide had changed. Less fishing ground, more paperwork, more quota that isn't enough. The dock knew without reading rules. Each season, more hulls were scrapped than sent to sea. In the countryside, Europe brought checks and scissors. The quotas taught people to measure the milk before selling it. The paid uprootings turned rows of vines into clear patches of land. The staples, corn, wheat, barley, started coming from outside because what was produced here was no longer enough. In the factories, globalization arrived in a big way. When tariffs and quotas fell, the looms fell silent. Those who didn't have a brand, design, or speed shut down. A few pockets held out because of identity, not because of price. The rest became a warehouse for whatever arrives in a container. Funds arrived. Bridges, highways, and industrial parks were built. It was filled with infrastructure, and many times the big contracts ended up back in the same companies where the money started. Concrete shined. The muscle shrank. The map was modernized on the outside, while on the inside it lost workshops, slipways, and mills. The balance can't fit in a chart. It's a trade that's no longer taught, a tool that nobody asks for, a suitcase with a one-way ticket. It's a father who worked in metalworking and a son who works in logistics. It's a town that used to live off the sea and now lives off the high season. It's a country that traded hands for forms and production for dependence. They told us that Europe would bring modernity, and it did. Roads we didn't have before, rules that straightened out what was crooked, stability that was needed, but with a contract that almost no one read out loud. Shut down where we were strong, cut back where we excelled, buy from abroad what we used to make at home. The word project started to feel too small. The word framework replaced it. A country without its own project ends up living in others' projects. It's not nostalgia, it's memory. Because memory is not looking back with sadness, but looking forward with a name. And the name of Spain was never just a form to fill out. It was a roaring grandstand, a crowded port, and a countryside that could stand on its own.
They sold us modernization. We paid with capacity. And the real bill was sovereignty.
Subscribe to the Historia Hispana channel so we never forget our legacy. Help me by sharing this video, comment, and give it a like. Thanks always to the entire community of the Historia Hispana channel.